What kind of mother kills her own child? Sounds unthinkable, right? But for 5-year-old Maha, it was a tragic reality. Maha was bright, full of life, loved by everyone, and then gone, just like that. The way it happened? Cold, calculated, almost inhuman. Her mother, Alexus Nelson, once thought adoption was the best option. But when that didn't work out, she made a decision that no one saw coming. Instead of finding another way, she ended Maha's life. And then she tried to wipe away every trace, as if she could erase what she did. But the truth always finds a way out. Maha was just 5, tiny frame, big personality. She was one of those kids who could walk into a room and instantly own it. Full of energy, always smiling, always laughing. You couldn't be around her without feeling that contagious joy. Whether she was running around with friends or making silly faces on video calls with her grandma. Maha had this way of making life feel lighter. Those video calls? Pure gold. Giggles, warmth, and moments that should have been just the beginning of a lifetime of memories. But then, gone. Just like that. In an instant, her future wasn't hers anymore. Stolen, and the worst part, the person who was supposed to protect her didn't. Now instead of growing up, Maha became a memory, a story told with heartbreak, a reminder of how cruel reality can be. Alexus Nelson wasn't always this distant, unrecognizable version of herself. Once she was just a young woman with dreams, simple ones like stability, happiness, and maybe a life that didn't feel like a constant uphill battle. But life doesn't always cooperate. And for Alexus, it never really had. She lived far from family, struggled financially, and carried the weight of a past she never talked about. She had learned early on that the safest way to get through life was to keep people at a distance. Ask for help? No chance. Alexus wasn't the kind to lean on anyone. She was the kind to endure. And then there were the fears. To her, the world outside was unpredictable, dangerous, strangers, familiar faces. It didn't matter. She saw threats where others saw ordinary life, and so she kept Maha close, convinced that if she controlled everything, she could keep her safe. But isolation doesn't just shut the world out. It can also lock something much darker in. The more you learned about Alexus, the clearer it became. She was terrified of being judged, terrified of being abandoned. So she did the only thing that made sense to her. She pushed people away before they had the chance to leave. Call it self-preservation, call it self-sabotage. Either way, it was a lonely way to live. But here's the thing, whatever pain she carried, whatever trauma shaped her, none of it could justify what she did next. Because at some point, fear stops being an excuse, and choices start defining who you really are. Then there was Maha Hobbs, Maha's father. He was always there, just in the background. He wasn't the perfect dad, but he wasn't absent either. A professional fighter by trade, he knew how to take a hit. He just didn't expect one to come from Alexus. They weren't together, but he still tried. FaceTimes, check-ins, whatever little moments he could get. But slowly the calls stopped being answered. The texts went unread. And before he knew it, Alexus had shut him out completely. The distance between him and Maha wasn't just physical anymore. It was intentional. And that kind of hurt lingers. For 2 whole years, Terrell had no contact with his daughter. No visits, no calls, nothing. The last time he saw Maha, she was still wobbling around like a tiny drunk person, just learning to walk. Now, she was growing up without him, and he had no way in. He tried, he really did. But every call went unanswered, every message ignored. It was like screaming into a void, except the void occasionally left him unread. The worst part? He wanted to be there. He wanted to raise his daughter, but Alexus had already made that decision for him. Then the tragedy hit, and suddenly, Terrell wasn't just grieving. He was drowning in guilt. He wasn't there when Maha needed him most, and no matter how hard he tried, he'd never be able to change that. Now let's talk about Asia Whitley Shaw, Maha's grandmother. She lived miles away, but still did her best to stay involved. And lately, she wasn't liking what she was seeing. Alexus had always been a little distant, but this was different. Her messages became vague, her calls less frequent. And then there were the red flags, big, waving in the wind, Someone should probably look into this, red flags. The biggest? Alexus casually mentioning rehoming Maha. Rehoming, like she was a puppy that got too big for the apartment. Asia knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how bad it really was. It all started with unease. But unease has a way of turning into regret when no one listens in time. Asia Whitley Shaw knew something was off. At first it was just a feeling, that gut instinct that gnaws at you when things don't add up. She had always tried to stay connected with her daughter, Alexus Nelson, and her granddaughter, Maha. But lately, Alexus had been acting weird. The messages got shorter, the calls became rare, and then there were the bizarre offhand comments, like the time Alexus casually mentioned rehoming Maha. Rehoming, like she was a Craigslist couch that didn't fit the new decor. At first, Asia tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. Maybe Alexus was just overwhelmed. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But when she pressed for details, Alexus had nothing. No agency name, no paperwork, just vague, unsettling excuses. That's when concern turned into full-blown panic. On May 30th, 2023, Asia did something no grandmother should ever have to do. She called the Aurora Police Department and asked for a welfare check on Maha. She couldn't ignore the alarm bells ringing in her head anymore. When officers knocked on Alexus's door, she greeted them with a story so neat, so rehearsed that it immediately raised suspicion. She claimed she had placed Maha for adoption through an agency called Adoptions with Love. A touching name, really. Very Hallmark. To make it all seem legit, she even handed the cops a phone number. Confident. Too confident. Like she'd planned this conversation in front of a mirror. But here's the thing. Good lies feel natural. Bad lies feel scripted. And something about Alexus's story just wasn't clicking. The officers had a bad feeling. And they were right. The officers didn't waste any time. They dialed the number Alexus gave them, expecting to confirm her adoption story and move on. But instead of validation, they got confusion. Adoptions with Love? The agency rep repeated, clearly puzzled. Yeah, we've never heard of an Alexus Nelson or a Maha. And just like that, Alexus's neatly packaged excuse fell apart. Now the detectives weren't just suspicious, they were certain. Something wasn't adding up, and Alexus was standing right in the middle of it with a half-baked story and zero receipts. Sensing the shift, Alexus pivoted. New plan, new story. This time she pulled a name out of nowhere. Janet Dunn. Allegedly, Janet was the one who had helped her find an adoption agency. Okay, so where can we find Janet Dunn? The detectives asked. No clue. Which agency did she work with? Can't remember. Any emails, documents, literally anything? Oh, I threw all that away. Didn't want my family looking for Maha. Yeah. That's when the officers knew. This wasn't just a weird misunderstanding. Then came the real kicker. When they searched Alexus's phone, they expected to find something. An email, a message, a single piece of evidence that supported her claims. But no. What they found was nothing. No adoption inquiries, no paper trail, and the most chilling part, no pictures of Maha. It was as if Alexus had hit the delete button on her daughter's entire existence. On paper, online, and possibly in real life. At this point, the detectives weren't just suspicious. They were certain. Alexus wasn't just hiding something. She was burying it 6 feet deep and hoping no one would dig it up. But that's exactly what they were about to do. They started with a background check, hoping to find any trace of this so-called adoption. But guess what? Nothing. No records, no paperwork, not even a shady Craigslist ad offering a free slightly used child. Alexus's story wasn't just falling apart. It was crumbling like a sandcastle in a hurricane. But the real bombshell came when they checked her phone. Among the usual texts, calls, and oddly high number of food delivery orders, something else stood out. Her Google search history. 2 searches in particular made the detectives' stomachs drop. Can you overdose from melatonin? Can you overdose from Xanax? And that's when the case took a very dark turn. At this point, suspicion had officially clocked out and been replaced by certainty. This wasn't some tragic accident. This wasn't a mother making a desperate decision. This was something else entirely. And the cops? They knew it. But trying to get a straight answer out of Alexus was like asking a politician to just answer yes or no. A complete waste of time. Every time they pushed, she dodged. Every time they confronted her, she twisted the story. Every time they got close to the truth, she ran in the opposite direction, like an Olympic sprinter, but for lying. And just when it seemed like they were hitting a dead end, in walked Nick Bagel. Now Nick, he wasn't a cop. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't trying to solve a crime. He was just a guy doing his job, a maintenance worker making his rounds, checking apartments, probably counting down the minutes until his lunch break. But on May 5th, 2023, his casual inspection of Alexus's apartment changed everything. From the moment he walked in, something felt off. Then he noticed Maha's bedroom door was locked. Not just locked, rigged. Someone had tied a string from the bedroom door to the bathroom door on the other side, making it impossible to open. Now, Nick wasn't an expert in crime scene investigations, but he'd seen enough horror movies to know that when you stumble upon a locked room with makeshift booby traps, it's never a good sign. At first, Nick Bagel thought he was just dealing with another weird apartment situation. You know, leaky faucets, busted AC, maybe a tenant who definitely wasn't getting their security deposit back. But then things got real weird. He could hear a TV playing inside Maha's room. Not crying, not laughter, not the usual sounds of a kid's bedroom. Just a TV. That's when Nick made the call. Time to open the door. Except there was a problem. The door wasn't just locked. It was tied shut with a string. Now, if you walk into an apartment and find a door rigged shut, Home Alone style, you turn around and leave. But Nick, he was just trying to do his job. So he started cutting the string, and just as he was about to figure out what the heck was going on, "Get out!" Alexus's voice boomed through a baby monitor. At this point, Nick decided, you know what? I don't get paid enough for this. His gut told him something was seriously wrong, the kind of wrong that makes your stomach twist in knots long after you've left the scene. And oh boy, was he right. The investigation blows wide open. Detectives weren't messing around anymore. The inconsistencies in Alexus's story, her missing kid, and now this, it was time to go in. With a search warrant in hand, Detective Jacob Schwartz and his team stormed back into Alexus's Aurora, Colorado apartment. And what they found? Absolutely chilling. Maha's room was empty. No bed, no toys, no clothes, no proof a kid had ever lived there. Just a dirty, stained carpet and the eerie feeling that something terrible had happened. But it wasn't just Maha's room. The entire apartment was wiped clean of her existence. No family photos, no kids' clothes in the laundry, not even a finger painting stuck to the fridge. It was as if Alexus had digitally deleted Maha from existence. And speaking of digital footprints, the detectives seized Alexus's phone. They expected something, a text, a call log, a single photo of the daughter she supposedly loved. But what did they find? Nothing. Not a single picture of Maha, not one moment of her existence captured. And that's when reality started to sink in. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just abandonment. This was something much, much darker. And Alexus, she was running out of lies. At first, the patio looked normal. A couple of dusty chairs, some neglected plants barely clinging to life, and the classic "I swear I'll clean this up next weekend" pile of old boxes. But then, the smell hit them. And let me tell you, this wasn't your usual "something died in the back of the fridge" smell. This was something way worse. Detectives felt their stomachs turn inside out. They followed the stench, eyes scanning every inch of the patio, until one of them spotted it, a utility closet shoved in the corner. And the second they cracked it open, boom, the smell hit 10 times harder. Inside, buried under random junk, was a large plastic bag. Now let's be real. When detectives find a bag that smells like death, they already know it's not going to be a bag of expired takeout. With hands steady but hearts racing, they peeled back the plastic. And that's when the horror set in. Bones, charred, blackened, almost unrecognizable. But there was no doubt. It was Maha. Reality hits like a freight train, Detective Schwartz had seen some messed up things in his career. Murders, cover-ups, cases that made even the most hardened officers question humanity. But this was on a whole different level of messed up. He stood there frozen, staring into that plastic bag of pure nightmare fuel. Detective Roberts, normally the guy who could joke about anything, just turned away. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like he might snap a tooth. And Schwartz? Well, he just stood there, trying real hard to remember why he even became a cop in the first place. Because this wasn't just another crime scene. This was the kind of thing that sticks with you forever. A mother's love? Yeah, right. The real kicker? This wasn't some random psycho. This was a mother. The one person who was supposed to love, protect, and, at the very least, not burn her own child like she was trying to delete a bad email. The air in the apartment felt heavier, like the walls themselves knew they had been keeping one hell of a secret. The crime scene team worked in silence, carefully bagging what was left of Maha. And as they did, the detectives couldn't help but wonder, what goes through someone's head when they decide, yeah, this is the best way to handle things? What was Alexus thinking? Actually, scratch that. Was she even thinking at all? DNA test? Yeah, we already know. Of course, the remains were sent off for official identification. But let's be real. Everyone in that room already knew. This was Maha. And Alexus? Yeah, she was officially out of lies to tell. The horror show was just getting started. Burned remains? That was just the opening act. The real horror? That came when the coroner tried to figure out how Maha died. Because the fire wasn't necessarily what killed her. Asphyxiation? Poison? A good old-fashioned case of, I don't want to be a mom anymore? Homicide? Nobody knew. And that made things even worse. Because when you can't even tell how someone was killed, you know the killer went above and beyond to cover their tracks. Alexus didn't just try to erase Maha. She hit the permanent delete button and cleared her trash folder. Not a missing person case anymore. A murder case. The detectives had their confirmation now. Maha wasn't missing. She was dead. And Alexus? She wasn't just a struggling mom with a bad alibi anymore. She was a full-blown horror movie villain. The kind of person you expect to see in a Netflix true crime documentary with an ominous piano soundtrack. But what really happened? How far had she gone? And more importantly, how many more skeletons, or, in this case, charred remains, were hiding in Alexus's metaphorical closet? The clock was ticking. While the lab geeks in white coats ran every possible test, the detectives were stuck waiting for answers, waiting for Alexus to slip up, waiting for the truth to finally crawl out from whatever dark, messed up hole it was hiding in. Because this wasn't just about what happened. It was about why. Why does a mother wake up one day and think, you know what? I'd rather commit a felony than just be a decent parent? And more importantly, how long had this been coming? One thing was for sure. Alexus had tried really hard to rewrite the ending of this story. But now it was the detectives' turn to take the pen. The curtain falls on Alexus Nelson, but not before one last act, May 31st, 2023. The day Alexus Nelson's I'm a Loving Mother performance finally flopped. The cops had spent days stitching together the gruesome truth. And now, it was time for Alexus to take center stage, in handcuffs. Her new titles: child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased body, attempting to influence a public servant, aka being a monster trying and failing to cover it up. Thinking she was smarter than the law, spoiler alert, she wasn't. From free woman to mugshot in 60 seconds, the moment was cinematic. The detectives, stone-faced, the handcuffs extra tight, the reality undeniable. No more excuses, no more crocodile tears, no more, but I'm the victim here. Alexus was officially a prison-bound psychopath, and as she was marched out of her apartment, there was only one thing left to decide. Would she go for the classic stoic murderer look, or break out the crying Karen special? Hint, she went full, why is this happening to me mode. Meanwhile, in the tragedy department, Maha's father, Maha Hobbs, wasn't handling it well. The man had been cut out of Maha's life for 2 years, and now, The woman he once trusted had turned their daughter into a true crime headline. The emotions were a blender of rage, guilt, and heartbreak. Because where was he when Maha needed saving? The weight of that question would haunt him forever. The show's not over yet. The detectives weren't celebrating just yet. Arresting Alexus was just the opening act. Now came the real work. Building a case so airtight that even Alexis's best attempt at courtroom dramatics wouldn't save her. Because this wasn't just about making an arrest. This was about justice for Maha. And the people who failed her? They were going to have to answer for it. Guilt, grief, and a whole lot of questions. Terrell Hobbs was drowning in what-ifs. Should he have fought harder to stay in Maha's life? Could he have seen this coming? Was there a moment, a single phone call, a visit, a legal battle that could have stopped this? But guilt is a merciless thing. It makes you feel responsible for things you never had control over. And the harshest truth of all? No amount of regret could bring Maha back, a grandmother's worst nightmare. Asia Whitley Shaw, Maha's grandmother, had tried to be in her life. She had made the calls, sent the messages, and fought for moments with her granddaughter. And now, she was standing in a world where Maha no longer existed. Learning that her granddaughter had been burned beyond recognition was like taking a sledgehammer to the soul. But the real horror? Knowing that the monster responsible was her own daughter, the same little girl she had once tucked in at night, the same child she had raised. Asia had failed to recognize the darkness growing inside Alexus, and now she would never forgive herself. The defense tries a plot twist. Alexis's lawyers had their own tragic backstory ready. They painted her as a broken woman, scarred by a traumatic past, overwhelmed by motherhood, and gripped by the irrational belief that no one could care for Maha like she could. In their version, Alexus wasn't a murderer. She was a victim, someone who had simply snapped under pressure, a woman who had been too scared, too lost, too damaged to do the right thing. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. Yes, Alexus had a difficult past. Yes, she had struggled. Yes, life had been unfair to her. But here's the thing, millions of people have trauma, millions of people have painful childhoods, and yet they don't incinerate their kids. Alexus had options. She could have asked for help. She could have reached out. She could have made better choices. Instead, she chose murder. And no amount of sad storytelling was going to erase that. A mother's betrayal. Alexus Nelson had options. She had a way out. She had a safety net. But instead of reaching for help, she reached for violence. The prosecution wasn't buying the sob story. Alexus didn't just snap. She didn't panic and make a mistake. This was a choice, a deliberate and calculated decision. She could have placed Maha in a safe home. She could have called someone, anyone. She could have done better, but she didn't. And now she was facing the consequences. Justice or just a deal? The case reached its breaking point on June 12, 2023. Alexus stood before the court, knowing her life was about to change forever. For weeks, the legal battle had been a war zone of shock, grief, and overwhelming evidence. And then in a move that stunned everyone, Alexus pleaded guilty, second-degree murder, tampering with a deceased body, attempting to influence a public servant. But here's where things got messy. The first-degree murder charge? Dropped. The child abuse resulting in death charge? Gone. Why? A plea deal. A deal that would bring closure to the case. But at what cost? The fallout, Terrell Hobbs sat in the courtroom, numb. This woman had killed his daughter. This woman had burned Maha's body. This woman had lied, manipulated, and destroyed lives. And now, she was getting a deal? It didn't sit right. It didn't feel like justice. Because no matter how many years Alexus spent behind bars, Maha was never coming back. A sentence that couldn't heal. Alexus Nelson took a life. No plea deal could change that. No legal ruling could erase what she had done. But the legal system had spoken. Judge Joseph Whitfield delivered the final blow. 48 years for second-degree murder. 24 years for tampering with Maha's remains. 12 years for trying to manipulate investigators. A total of 84 years. A lifetime behind bars. The courtroom was silent. For Maha's family, the sentence was something. Not justice, not closure, just something. Alexus would rot in prison, but Maha, she was gone. And no number of years, trials, or verdicts could change that. The unanswered question. The case was over, but one question remained. How did it come to this? Alexus had a past, a history of pain, a mind fractured by trauma. But did that excuse her? Absolutely not. She had choices, she had options, she had help. Instead, she chose violence. She chose to erase Maha, not because she had no way out, but because in the end, she never looked for one. A life stolen too soon. Maha Hobbs should have had a future, a life filled with love, laughter, and joy. Instead, her story was cut short. She was loved, she was cherished, but in the end, the person meant to protect her was the one who took it all away. Maha deserved better. The hardest truth. Not all monsters lurk in the dark. Some live behind smiles. Some call themselves family. Alexus Nelson wasn't just Maha's mother. She was supposed to be her shield, her safe place. Instead, she became the reason Maha never saw another sunrise. What can we learn? This story isn't just about one tragedy. It's about the silent battles people fight, the untreated trauma that festers, the mental health struggles that go ignored. How many more lives will be lost before we take action? How many more children will suffer before the system steps in? We can't change Maha's fate, but we can change how we respond to warning signs. A final thought. If this story leaves you with one message, it's this: pay attention to the quiet cries, to the hidden pain, because sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones no one is looking at. Rest in peace, Maha. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more stories that need to be told.